The fluorescent lights of the mall hummed above, casting a sterile glow across the bustling corridor. A sea of people walked by, all caught in their own worlds, absorbed in shopping bags or the soft hum of their phones. But at one of the counters in the jewelry store, a young man stood, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a delicate gold bracelet on the counter. He was dressed in second-hand clothes, the kind of worn-out jeans that hinted at a life lived paycheck to paycheck. His skin was dark, the color of rich coffee, and his eyes held a quiet sadness that most people never took the time to notice. Marcus knew what they were thinking. He could see it in the clerk's eyes before she even spoke. A look that spoke louder than words ever could. A dismissive glance that seemed to say, "This is a person who doesn't belong here." The clerk, a young woman, no older than him, with blonde hair tied up in a neat ponytail, smiled a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked as though he was an inconvenience. Marcus smiled back, forcing his voice to steady as he spoke. "I just wanted to buy this." Her eyes flickered over him, scrutinizing him in a way that felt almost too familiar. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But still, it stung, the weight of her silent judgment pressing against him, making his pulse quicken. "That'll be $350, she said, her tone cold. Marcus's hand dug into his pocket, fingers brushing against the crumpled receipt and the few dollars he had left. But he wasn't worried. He wasn't here for a bracelet. He was here for something much bigger, something no one would expect. "I'll take everything," he said, the words coming out more confident than he felt. The clerk blinked, clearly thrown off guard. "Excuse me?" "I'll take everything in the store," he repeated, his voice firmer now. She laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. "You're joking, right?" Marcus's heart pounded, but his expression remained calm, unflinching. He had anticipated this moment, prepared for it. It was just another test of how far people would go to underestimate him. "No," he said simply. "I'm not." The clerk's gaze hardened as she picked up the phone, dialing a number, her face a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. She muttered something into the receiver, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. "Manager," she said curtly. Marcus stood still, his nerves prickling beneath his skin. He could hear the clatter of people shopping around him, the laughter of children echoing in the distance, the faint murmur of conversations. He was a part of all this, but at the same time, he wasn't. He never had been. A few minutes later, a man in a suit, his manager no doubt, approached, his face a mask of professionalism. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over Marcus in much the same way as the clerk had. Marcus remained calm, his voice steady. "I want to buy everything in your store, every single item." The manager's smile was polite, almost patronizing. "That's not really how things work here," he said, glancing at the clerk for support. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick stack of bills, hundreds, all freshly minted, and placed them on the counter. The manager froze, his eyes widening as he looked at the money. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the mall seemed to fade away, as though the entire world had paused, waiting for something monumental to happen. "I'll pay for everything," Marcus repeated, his voice low but undeniable. The manager's face shifted from disbelief to something akin to panic. He glanced at the clerk, who now seemed almost as stunned as he was. The whole store felt like it was holding its breath. The news spread quickly. By the time Marcus left the jewelry store, his name was already circulating through the mall, whispered from one store to the next. People stared as he walked past, a quiet ripple of astonishment following him like a shadow. He didn't need to check the receipt to know that he had bought more than just the jewelry. He had bought their respect. The clerk who had laughed at him, the manager who had underestimated him, they were all part of the system that had written him off long ago. They thought he didn't belong in a place like this, but Marcus was here to prove them wrong. As he passed the food court, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from his cousin, Jamal. "Did you really buy the whole mall?" Marcus couldn't help but smile. It wasn't about the money, he knew that. It was about standing up in the face of those who believed people like him didn't belong, people who would never take the time to understand his struggles, his worth. It was about proving to them that he was more than the clothes he wore, more than the life they expected him to live. He was everything they didn't see. Back at the jewelry store, the clerk was still standing behind the counter, her face flushed with disbelief. She had seen people like Marcus before, people who came in with barely enough to buy a trinket, people whose lives she couldn't even imagine. But this was something different. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the way he held himself, the way he didn't back down when she laughed at him. She wanted to laugh again, to dismiss him, to act as though it hadn't just happened. But something in her had changed. It wasn't just Marcus's purchase. It was the way he carried himself, as if the world hadn't already told him where he belonged, where he could go, who he could be. She would remember him long after he had left, long after the cashiers had counted the money and placed it in the safe. She would remember the way his presence seemed to command attention, as though he was no longer invisible in a world that had always overlooked him. The manager came in a few minutes later, his face drawn with tension. "What just happened here?" The clerk shrugged, still trying to process it all. "I don't know, but he's not who we thought he was." Marcus had walked away from the mall, but it wasn't the end. In many ways, it was just the beginning. The world was full of judgments, of people who looked at him and saw nothing but stereotypes. But he wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. He was more than what they saw. He was more than the clothes he wore, more than the life they expected him to lead. And if they wouldn't accept that, well, he'd find a way to make them. For the first time in a long while, Marcus didn't feel like the world was looking down on him. He had taken control, and now the world would have to catch up. Marcus had always done his best to avoid situations where people might judge him. His mother had taught him to keep his head down, blend in, and never draw attention to himself. It was a survival tactic, one that kept him from standing out in a world that often saw him as nothing more than a statistic. But today, as he stood in the middle of the high-end shopping mall, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was different. He had been in this mall countless times before, mostly just walking through to get to the bus stop or grab a coffee. But today was different. Today he had come to buy something for himself. A rare treat after months of scrimping and saving. It wasn't much, just a simple bracelet from a local jewelry store, but it felt like a step toward something better. A way to tell himself that he was worth more than the worn clothes he often had to wear and the harsh looks he received from strangers. As he walked into the store, the elegant displays and polished counters made him feel out of place. He was used to cramped stores with plastic shelves and low-budget products, not the glittering jewels behind glass, under soft lights. He glanced around nervously, unsure of how to act in such a pristine environment. The cold, polished counters made him feel small, his faded jeans and scuffed sneakers a sharp contrast to the luxury surrounding him. The store clerk looked up from behind the counter, her eyes scanning him in a way that was all too familiar. A slight frown formed on her face, her lips curling into a forced smile. She didn't even try to hide the judgment in her eyes. Marcus knew the look all too well, the unspoken assumption that someone like him didn't belong here, the type of look that reminded him he was out of his element. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, her voice polite but laced with a subtle condescension. Marcus had grown used to the way people spoke to him, as though he were less intelligent or capable, but it didn't stop the sting. He forced a smile, hoping to disarm her, and reached for the bracelet on the display. "I'd like to buy this," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. The clerk's eyes flickered over him, sizing him up quickly, and without missing a beat, she glanced down at the price tag. $350, she said flatly, almost as though she had expected him to balk. "Is that something you can afford?" Her words hit Marcus like a slap. She hadn't even tried to hide her disbelief, her assumption that a man like him couldn't afford such a simple luxury. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the pressure building in his chest. The temptation to walk out and leave her to her judgment was strong, but something inside him refused to back down. "Not today." "I'll take it," he said, his voice stronger now. He pulled out his wallet, his fingers brushing against the few crumpled bills he had left. But then something inside him shifted, a resolve that felt like a spark igniting deep within him. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. "No, I'll take everything," he said, his voice growing firmer. His words hung in the air, weighty and defiant. He was no longer just a customer. He was making a statement. The clerk blinked at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "I want to buy everything in the store," Marcus repeated, his tone calm but resolute. The clerk glanced at him as though he were joking. She laughed, a quick, sharp laugh, the sound echoing in the quiet store. "That's not how things work here," she said dismissively, turning away from him to pick up the phone. "I'll need to call the manager." Marcus stood still, waiting. He knew exactly how this would play out. She'd call the manager, he'd arrive with a polite but firm refusal, and then Marcus would be escorted out of the store, his dignity and hope for something better shattered once again. But something inside him refused to accept that narrative. Today was not the day he would leave with his tail between his legs. His heart began to pound in his chest, the familiar adrenaline rush that came with standing up to people who didn't see him for who he was. In his mind, the store clerk had become a symbol of the world's dismissive attitude toward him, toward people like him. The assumption that he would never be anything more than what they saw on the surface. But he refused to be invisible anymore. The manager, a man in his mid-40s wearing a suit that screamed wealth and authority, arrived with a brief glance in Marcus's direction. He approached with an air of practiced calm, no doubt used to dealing with all kinds of situations. He exuded confidence, the type of person who thought he had seen it all. His eyes flicked to the clerk, who was still standing behind the counter, her face a mixture of confusion and amusement. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, his voice smooth but with an edge of impatience. The clerk glanced back at Marcus before answering. "He's asking to buy everything in the store," she said, still with that mocking smile. "I don't think he understands the concept of luxury shopping." The manager raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request. "Is that so?" he said, his tone amused but dismissive. "I'm afraid that's not really how we do things here." But Marcus didn't flinch. He stood there, feet planted firmly on the ground, his mind clear. He wasn't just talking about jewelry. He was talking about the years of being ignored, of being told he wasn't good enough, of being told where he belonged and where he didn't. Today he was done playing by their rules. "I'll buy everything," Marcus repeated, his voice unwavering. The manager looked at the clerk again, then back at Marcus. There was a moment of tension, a flicker of doubt in the manager's eyes. Marcus could see it. He was calculating, weighing his options. The mall was a high-end establishment, the kind of place where people came to spend money, not someone like Marcus. But he had no idea how wrong he was. The manager's lips tightened into a thin line, his smile faltering. "Let me check with corporate," he said reluctantly, turning to grab his phone. But Marcus didn't let the moment slip away. As the manager dialed the number, Marcus's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment where he could prove that he wasn't just another person on the margins, that he could stand tall, even in a world that had always tried to push him down. The stakes had been set. Marcus had made his choice, and there was no going back now. Marcus sat in a small back room of the store, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, casting an unsettling glow over the sterile white walls. The manager had left him there to wait while he checked with corporate, which felt more like a delay tactic than a real attempt to resolve the situation. The store clerk's laughter still echoed in his mind, the way she had written him off before he even opened his mouth. It stung, but it also fueled him. He wasn't going to let them define his worth, not today. As the minutes stretched on, his nerves began to fray. He had come here with a sense of purpose, a small victory in his mind. But now that victory felt fragile. Could he really go through with this? Could he really buy everything in the store? Was he even capable of it? His thoughts spiraled into self-doubt. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of all the times she had told him to keep his head down, to never make waves. She had raised him with the belief that survival meant not attracting attention, not demanding too much. It was a belief shaped by years of hardship, of lessons learned through experience. But Marcus had grown tired of living in the shadows. He wanted more. He needed more. But what if this was too much? What if he wasn't meant for this kind of life, for this kind of success? What if he failed in front of everyone? What if he didn't belong? The sound of a knock on the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. It was the manager, looking more composed now that he had returned from his consultation with corporate. "We've decided to approve the purchase," the manager said, his tone professional but distant. "But I'll need to process the payment now. If you could come with me, we'll start with the bracelet." Marcus stood up, his legs momentarily unsteady. He had expected some sort of confrontation, but this was almost worse. The ease with which they were complying made him feel like he was walking into a trap. He followed the manager out of the back room and into the main part of the store, his mind still clouded with doubt. The clerk was behind the counter again, now with a strange expression on her face, part disbelief, part judgment. She looked at him as if she were waiting for him to crack under the pressure, to back down and admit that he wasn't capable of going through with it. Marcus didn't flinch. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. The manager began processing the payment for the bracelet, but Marcus's mind wasn't on the transaction. It was on the price tag, on the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise surrounding him. Could he really afford to buy it all? The more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. His savings account was far from adequate. He had worked multiple jobs, lived frugally, scraped by for years, but there was no way he could come up with that kind of money. His anxiety gnawed at him, but he refused to let it show. Still, his fear lingered like a shadow. What if they called his bluff? What if he couldn't follow through on his declaration? The stakes had risen too high, and Marcus felt the weight of his own challenge pressing down on him. But then, something unexpected happened. As the manager swiped his card to process the payment for the bracelet, there was a hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. The card was declined. The manager's brows furrowed, but he quickly masked his reaction, swiping the card again. "It must be a mistake," he said, his voice thin with tension. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had feared. He felt a flush of heat rise to his cheeks. He had been so certain, so confident, and now here he was, on the brink of failure. He looked up at the manager, trying to hide the panic in his eyes. The clerk looked over at him again, her lips curling into a smug smile. She knew what was happening. She had been waiting for this moment. She had known from the start that Marcus would never be able to follow through. But Marcus wasn't ready to give up yet. "Try it again," he said, his voice low but firm. The manager glanced at him, unsure of whether to argue or comply, but he swiped the card again, this time slower, with more scrutiny. "No," the manager said, this time with a hint of finality. "The card is still declined. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." Marcus's mind raced, but then something shifted inside him. The spark he had felt earlier flared to life again. If he couldn't rely on his own funds, maybe he didn't have to. Maybe he could find another way. "I'll pay in cash," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. The words felt foreign coming out of his mouth, but they were the only option left. The manager paused for a moment, caught off guard by the statement, but then quickly recovered. "Cash?" he repeated, his voice disbelieving. "Cash," Marcus confirmed, his voice growing more certain with each word. The manager's gaze flicked to the clerk, then back at Marcus. There was a long pause before the manager spoke again. "Very well, but we'll need to confirm the amount." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how he was going to pull this off, but he was determined. He couldn't back down now. As the manager moved to check the registers and process the transaction, Marcus's thoughts whirled. What had he just done? How had he gotten himself into this situation? The stakes had escalated, and he could feel the pressure mounting. But then, just as he was about to lose himself in the weight of it all, the doors to the store suddenly swung open, and a tall man walked in. The man was dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding attention as he strode into the store with a sense of authority. His eyes locked onto Marcus immediately, and he walked toward him with an air of purpose. The manager stopped what he was doing and immediately approached the new arrival. "Mr. Grant," he said with a tone of respect, "I didn't expect you today." Mr. Grant extended his hand to the manager and shook it firmly. "I came to see the new collections," he said smoothly, his eyes now fixed on Marcus. Marcus stood still, his anxiety growing by the second. He didn't know who this man was, but the way the manager treated him, the respect in his voice, it sent a chill through him. "Who's this?" Mr. Grant asked, his gaze still fixed on Marcus. "This gentleman is attempting to make an unusual purchase," the manager said carefully. The look Mr. Grant gave Marcus was unreadable, his expression calculating, assessing. It was the kind of look that made Marcus feel small, insignificant, like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. And yet something in the air seemed to shift. The stakes had just risen higher, and Marcus had no idea how much further this could go. The moment Mr. Grant entered the store, Marcus felt a shift in the air, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. There was something unsettling about the man's gaze, intense, calculating. His presence alone commanded respect, as if everyone around him, including the manager and the clerk, had suddenly become subservient. Marcus stood frozen in place, feeling a mix of confusion and growing unease. "Mr. Grant," the manager had said, his voice tinged with reverence, "I didn't expect you today." Marcus's mind raced. Who was this man? Why was he treated with such reverence? And what did this mean for him and his growing challenge to take control of the store? Before Marcus could form another thought, Mr. Grant turned to him, his eyes narrowing. There was a brief flicker of recognition, though Marcus couldn't place where he had seen the man before. His grip on the edge of the counter tightened. Whatever was happening now was beyond his understanding. "Let me guess," Mr. Grant said smoothly, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're the one trying to buy the entire store." Marcus swallowed hard. "Yes," he replied, his voice strained but determined. He wasn't about to back down now, not after everything that had happened. Mr. Grant's lips curved into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he said, as if his words held a hidden meaning Marcus couldn't yet decipher. "You see, this store," he continued, gesturing around the high-end, meticulously organized space, "isn't just a store. It's a front, a means to an end for a much bigger game, and you've just walked into it." Marcus's confusion deepened. He had thought the challenge was simple: buy the whole store. But now everything was different. Mr. Grant's words hung in the air like an ominous warning, and Marcus realized that what seemed like a chance to prove his worth might be a far more dangerous game than he had anticipated. The manager glanced nervously at Mr. Grant, as if expecting some sort of signal. The clerk, who had been so smug earlier, now appeared more cautious. She too was unsure of what was unfolding before her eyes. Suddenly, a ripple of realization spread through Marcus. "What do you mean it's a front?" he asked, his voice rising with both frustration and fear. "What is this place really?" Mr. Grant's smile faded, and for a brief moment, his mask of calm slipped, revealing something much darker. "You think you're buying luxury goods, don't you? You think you're making a statement, challenging an entire system? But what you're really buying is access." The words hit Marcus like a blow to the chest. He wanted to believe he was in control of the situation, that he was taking back power, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "Access to what?" Marcus demanded, his heart racing. He was determined to keep his ground. He couldn't let this man, this unknown adversary, make him feel powerless. "A network," Mr. Grant replied, his voice now laced with something darker. "A network of people, decisions, power. You're not just a customer, you're being used as a pawn. Every product in this store is connected to something much bigger, something you aren't ready to understand." Marcus blinked in disbelief. "So what? This whole thing is a scam?" Mr. Grant let out a quiet chuckle. "Not a scam, no. It's an opportunity, but it's not for people like you." He motioned toward Marcus, his eyes scanning him with barely concealed disdain. "You've been playing at something far beyond your ability. You've been led to believe that your purchase here will bring you something great, but it's going to cost you more than you can afford." The weight of Mr. Grant's words pressed down on Marcus like a heavy stone. He had never imagined this. All he had wanted was to prove to everyone, especially the clerk, that he wasn't just some nobody, but now he was tangled in something far more sinister than he had ever anticipated. Suddenly, a realization hit Marcus with full force. If Mr. Grant was telling the truth, if the store was truly a front for something bigger, then his purchase wasn't going to bring him the validation he had sought. It was a trap. This entire situation, this entire moment, had been engineered to make him feel like he had power, when in fact he was just another piece in someone else's game. The power he thought he had was an illusion. His heart pounded in his chest. He had been so certain of his path, but now it all felt like a mistake. Was it too late to walk away? Could he undo what he had started before he was completely entangled in something he didn't understand? Mr. Grant's gaze never wavered. You can still walk away, Marcus. It's not too late, but if you don't, I can guarantee you'll regret it. You'll be swallowed up by a game you'll never escape. Marcus's mind was spinning. A part of him wanted to believe that it was all a bluff, a manipulation to scare him. But there was something in Mr. Grant's demeanor, something in the way he spoke, that made Marcus doubt himself. The situation had grown far more complex than he could have imagined. And then, just as Marcus was about to make a decision, the clerk spoke up. Her voice was sharp, almost vindictive. "I don't think you understand," she said, her eyes gleaming with a mix of contempt and triumph. "This store isn't about what you want. It's about what we allow you to have. And you, Marcus, have played right into our hands." Her words hit him like a wave of cold water. It was all a setup, a trap designed to expose his vulnerabilities. He had walked in with hope, with a plan to assert his place in the world. But now he saw it for what it was, a pawn's game. The decision before him was clear. He had a choice to make: walk away and admit that he had been outplayed, or continue down this path, knowing full well that it might lead to a much darker place than he could ever imagine. In that moment, Marcus had to confront everything he had believed about power, success, and identity. His next move would define not just his future, but the kind of person he would become. Marcus stood on the edge of something he could neither fully understand nor control. The store, once just a symbol of luxury and a place to prove himself, had morphed into a labyrinth of deceit. The clerk's words lingered in his mind, biting into his resolve. "You've played right into our hands." His pulse quickened as Mr. Grant and the others watched him, their gazes intense and calculating. It felt like the world had shifted beneath his feet, and in that moment, Marcus realized how little he truly knew. He had entered this place thinking it would bring him respect, validation, a chance to finally prove his worth to those who had looked down on him. But now the very foundation of his plan was crumbling. He stood frozen in the middle of the store, unsure of what to do next. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how far he had come and how far he might still fall. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Mr. Grant's voice broke the silence. The calm, measured tone made it sound like the game was already over. "You don't have to do this. You could walk away right now before it's too late." Marcus's mind raced. The weight of Mr. Grant's offer hung in the air like an escape route. But Marcus knew better than to believe it was that simple. Too late for what, he wondered. To back out now would mean admitting that he had been outsmarted, outplayed, that he had never been in control. It would be the end of his pursuit to claim power, to carve out a space for himself in a world that constantly seemed to deny him the chance. He couldn't go back now. He wouldn't. The clerk, watching him intently, stepped closer. Her voice was low but sharp, cutting through his thoughts. "Don't be naive, Marcus. You think you're going to change something? You think you're going to fix everything by buying this store? That's not how the world works. The game is already set. You're just a player." Her words dug into him, filling him with anger and frustration. He had never asked for permission. He had never wanted to play by anyone's rules. He had come here to challenge a system that had kept him in its grasp for too long, to stand up, to show the world that he wasn't just another person lost in the system, invisible and powerless. But now, it felt like the system was pulling the strings all along. "Are you really going to let them win?" The voice in his head, a whisper that sounded strangely like his father's, was the push he needed. For the first time, Marcus realized he was no longer just fighting for respect. He was fighting for his dignity, his agency, his very self-worth. His desire to be seen as more than what the world had labeled him was no longer a matter of vanity. It was a matter of survival. "Enough!" Marcus shouted, his voice filled with frustration, desperation, and determination. The sound echoed through the store, cutting through the tension that had built between them all. "I'm not backing down. You can all play your games, but I'll play my own. And I'll win." For the first time in the entire ordeal, Marcus felt a spark of defiance that burned hot in his chest. He had been manipulated, deceived, and led to believe that he was powerless. But now something had shifted. He wasn't playing by their rules anymore. This wasn't about buying the store. It was about taking back control of his life, his identity. Mr. Grant raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You think you can just rewrite the rules? That's adorable. But you're just a pawn in a much bigger game, Marcus. You can't escape it." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Mr. Grant's. The world around him faded into the background as he focused only on the man in front of him, the embodiment of everything that had kept him down. "I don't care if I'm a pawn," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'll be the best damn pawn you've ever seen, and I'll make my own moves. You won't control me anymore." A beat of silence followed, and for the first time, Marcus felt the weight of his own words. The fear that had clung to him since he'd entered the store began to melt away, replaced by something far stronger. It wasn't the arrogance of victory. It was the quiet strength of someone who had faced their fears and refused to bow to them. Mr. Grant, who had been so composed, seemed to hesitate. There was something in Marcus's gaze now, something he hadn't expected. The power dynamic had shifted, and the realization hit Mr. Grant with the force of a blow. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice no longer smooth and confident, but almost disbelieving. "You really think you can outmaneuver me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I don't need to know everything," Marcus replied, his voice low but firm. "I just need to know that I'm done being afraid." And with those words, the tension reached its peak. The store clerk's face twisted in anger, while the manager stood frozen, unsure of how to react. The entire room held its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. But it was Marcus, the man who had walked into this situation with nothing but a desire to prove himself, who was now standing firm, unshaken. The climax of this confrontation wasn't about brute force or a loud declaration. It was about Marcus finally understanding who he was, not what the world had made him out to be. And in that understanding, he found a quiet power that no one could take away. "I'm not going to play your game," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. "You want to use me, manipulate me? Fine, but I'm done being a pawn. I'll make my own moves, starting now." The world around him seemed to change in an instant. What had once felt like a trap now seemed like a playground, a place where Marcus, finally in control of his own fate, could rewrite his story. And in that moment, he understood. The real victory wasn't in the store or in proving his worth to others. The real victory was in reclaiming his own life, his own choices. And as Mr. Grant, the clerk, and the manager stood there, stunned and silent, Marcus knew one thing for sure. They had underestimated him, and that would be their mistake. The dust had barely settled in the store, and yet Marcus felt a shift in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was an unspoken understanding. Something had fundamentally changed, not just in the store, but within him. He stood there, surrounded by the remnants of what had once felt like an insurmountable challenge. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt at peace. The manager, Mr. Grant, and the clerk were no longer the intimidating figures they had been when he first walked through the doors. Their words, their smug expressions, their manipulative tactics, they all seemed so small now. In their attempt to control him, they had unwittingly pushed him into a corner where he had to find his true strength. And in that moment, Marcus realized something. They had never held the power he thought they did. It had always been his, quietly waiting for him to claim it. But the journey had left its mark. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the store an hour ago, desperate to prove something to a world that had often dismissed him. He had faced his fears, his doubts, and his deepest insecurities, and had come out on the other side, stronger, more self-aware. But the cost was real. Marcus's body felt like it had been put through a trial. His muscles ached with the weight of everything he had been carrying, everything he had been taught to believe. It wasn't just the pressure of fighting back against the system or proving his worth. It was the burden of realizing that the people who had made him feel small were nothing more than echoes of a broken system. A system that he now understood was a reflection of the very people who allowed it to exist. The clerk, who had once sneered at him, now stood with her arms crossed, watching him carefully. Her expression was no longer filled with scorn, but something more complex, maybe regret, maybe acknowledgement. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, as if unsure whether her words would carry any weight at this point. Mr. Grant's face had lost its veneer of confidence. He seemed smaller now, his posture slouched, his mouth tight with frustration. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice a brittle whisper. There was no conviction in his words anymore, only the hollow ring of someone who had been defeated without realizing it. Marcus met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to be seen. And now you see me." For a moment, the store was silent, the only sound being the distant hum of the overhead lights. It wasn't a victory cheer or the loud applause of some triumphant finale. It was a quiet, meaningful silence, the kind that lingers when the truth has been spoken. Mr. Grant swallowed hard, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He had no retort, no grand comeback. In that moment, Marcus knew he had won, not because of the money or the store, but because he had forced Mr. Grant to confront the very thing he had been avoiding, the truth of his own behavior. The illusion of power, control, and superiority had shattered. The game was no longer his to play. The clerk was the first to break the silence. "You really are different," she said, her voice no longer full of disdain, but something closer to awe. "You were just a pawn before, but now—" She shook her head, as if she couldn't quite finish the thought. But Marcus didn't need her to finish. He already knew what she meant. He wasn't a pawn anymore. He had moved beyond their games, their expectations, and that knowledge settled deep within him. As he walked out of the store, the cool night air wrapped around him like a balm, soothing the remnants of the tension he had carried all day. He wasn't sure where his journey would take him next. Maybe he would still face struggles, maybe even setbacks. But the difference was that he would face them as a man who had found his power, his voice, and his purpose. He didn't need the store. He didn't need their approval. What he had found deep within himself was something no one could take away, a belief in his own worth. And that, Marcus realized, was the real victory. The next morning, the story of his encounter with the store began to spread. The media latched onto it, casting it as a story of triumph over adversity. People spoke of the man who had bought the store, who had turned the tables on the system that sought to oppress him. But for Marcus, the headlines didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet sense of peace he had found in the aftermath of the confrontation. As for Mr. Grant and the clerk, the fallout from the store's unraveling was swift. Public opinion turned against them, the truth of their actions becoming undeniable. The systems they had relied on to maintain control began to crumble, one piece at a time. Their downfall wasn't dramatic, but it was inevitable, a slow burn of public scrutiny and exposure that chipped away at their authority. The store eventually changed hands, but it wasn't the grand spectacle Marcus had once imagined. Instead, it was a quiet shift, a recognition that people could no longer be controlled by the old rules. The new owners focused on creating a more inclusive and empowering environment for the community. They didn't try to erase the past, but instead sought to build something better from its ashes. As for Marcus, the journey had only just begun. He knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but he no longer feared them. He had learned that power didn't come from money or status, it came from within. And with that knowledge, there was no limit to what he could achieve. In the end, Marcus had not just survived the ordeal, he had been transformed by it. And though the world around him would continue to change, one thing remained certain. Marcus would never again be the man who walked into that store, searching for validation. He had found something far more valuable, the courage to stand on his own, and the strength to be seen for who he truly was. And as he walked away from the store for the last time, a sense of quiet victory washed over him. He didn't need anyone's approval anymore. He had already won. Marcus stood outside the now quiet mall, the soft hum of the world continuing around him. Yet everything felt different. The sun had set, casting a soft glow over the parking lot, and the air smelled fresh with the promise of new beginnings. As he leaned against the cool metal of a nearby bench, he closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of everything that had happened. The journey had been long, filled with moments of doubt, fear, and frustration. But it had also been a journey of revelation, a discovery of strength he didn't know he had, and the realization that he had always been in control of his own destiny. What the store clerk, the manager, and even society had tried to impose upon him no longer mattered. They had no power over him. The power was his to claim, to wield. And yet, despite the victories, Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change, both personal and societal, took time. He wasn't naive enough to believe that the world would instantly be different because of his actions. But what had shifted in him was far more significant. He no longer saw the world through the lens of a victim, but through the eyes of a man who knew his worth. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. He glanced down to see a message from his old friend Jordan, someone who had always been by his side, but hadn't quite understood the depths of his struggle until now. "You did it, man. You showed them. Proud of you." Marcus smiled, a deep, contented smile that spoke volumes. The battle wasn't over, but he had won something far more important than any external victory. He had earned his own respect. With a deep breath, Marcus stood and began to walk away from the mall, his steps steady and purposeful. There was no rush, no destination he had to get to in that moment. He was moving forward, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. As he walked into the night, the future, with all its uncertainties, felt just a little bit brighter.